October 1975, 11:42 p.m. A deserted parking lot on the industrial outskirts of Bogotá. The air is thick with the smell of damp earth and diesel exhaust, a precursor to the heavy rain that always seems to haunt the Colombian night. Under a flickering streetlight that hums with a low dying buzz, a woman stands alone against 6 armed men. Her name is Griselda Blanco. Facing her is the man who helped her build a kingdom, her husband and partner, Alberto Bravo. To any outside observer, she is outgunned and cornered. Alberto steps forward, his face illuminated by the pale yellow light, wearing the confident smile of a man who believes he has regained control. He reaches out for a conciliatory embrace, perhaps thinking a few soft words can mend the cracks in their empire. But Griselda does not move her arms. She stands like a statue carved from ice. She simply whispers a single word: accountant. In that moment, the smile vanishes. Alberto's face turns a ghostly shade of pale. He realizes too late that this wasn't a meeting to save a marriage, it was a final audit. This was the night the partnership died, and the legend of the Black Widow was born. To understand how these two titans of the underworld ended up in a standoff under a Bogotá streetlight, you have to understand the world they built together. By the mid-1970s, the cocaine trade was no longer a disorganized collection of street deals. It was becoming a multi-million-dollar machine, and Griselda and Alberto were its primary architects. They had pioneered the New York pipeline, turning the streets of Queens and Miami into a gold mine. Alberto was the diplomat, the man who handled the Colombian suppliers and the logistics of the move. Griselda, however, was the strategist. She was the one who realized that traditional smuggling was too risky, leading her to create a specialized lingerie factory in Medellin that manufactured bras and girdles with hidden compartments. It was a stroke of genius that allowed them to move hundreds of kilos right under the noses of the authorities. For years they were a perfect match, but in this business, money doesn't just buy power, it buys a very specific, poisonous kind of paranoia. As the profits grew from thousands to millions, the board began to shift. The elders in Medellin, the men who would eventually form the core of the great cartels, were starting to demand a more streamlined operation. They wanted a single head at the table, a single point of contact who could guarantee stability and minimize the heat from the growing interest of the DEA. Alberto Bravo saw this as his moment. He believed the business had outgrown what he called a woman's touch. He began to view Griselda not as his equal partner, but as a liability, someone too volatile, too visible, and too ambitious. What Alberto failed to realize was that the business only existed because of Griselda's ingenuity. While he was busy dining with the Medellin elite and playing the role of the Grand Patriarch, Griselda was the one who truly understood the mechanics of their empire. She didn't just know where the product was. She knew exactly where every cent of the money was supposed to go. She was obsessed with the ledgers. To her, the numbers told a story that people could lie about. She saw the cocaine trade not as a game of bravado, but as a mathematical equation that had to balance perfectly. If a decimal point was off, it wasn't just a mistake, it was a sign of a deeper rot. The tension between them began as a low simmer. Alberto started making decisions without her. He would meet with the cartel liaison, a man known as Pacho, and speak as if he were the sole proprietor of the Bravo organization. He began to whisper to their suppliers that Griselda was becoming erratic, suggesting that she should be sidelined for the good of the trade. To the men of the Medellin underworld, this made sense. They lived in a culture of machismo, where a woman's place was in the home, not in the counting room. Alberto was playing to their prejudices, hoping to isolate his wife and seize the New York territory for himself. But Griselda Blanco was never one to be sidelined. She felt the shift in the atmosphere long before Alberto made his move. She noticed the way the enforcers looked at her, less with respect and more with a cautious, lingering doubt. She saw the way the phone calls from New York were being diverted to Alberto's private line, and most importantly, she noticed the missing money. Alberto had made the fatal mistake of underestimating her mathematical mind. He believed she was too occupied with the street wars in New York to notice a few $1 million slipping through the cracks. He was wrong. Alberto began skimming. He managed to divert nearly $5 million into a private account in Zurich, Switzerland. It was a retirement fund, or perhaps a war chest for the day he finally decided to cut Griselda out of the picture entirely. He thought he was being clever, moving the money in small increments that would look like the cost of doing business, bribes, losses, and overhead. But Griselda had set a trap months ago. She had planted her own informants within the banking channels, people who valued her ironclad reliability over Alberto's flashy and often empty promises. The missing money wasn't a discovery she stumbled upon. It was a lure she had left out to see if her husband was as hungry as she suspected. The betrayal wasn't just about the cash. In their world, theft was a declaration of war. By taking that money, Alberto wasn't just stealing profits. He was attempting to strip Griselda of her status. He was telling her that she was no longer necessary. As the mid-70s cocaine explosion reached its peak, the stakes were higher than they had ever been. The organization was at a crossroads. They could either become the undisputed rulers of the New York-Columbia corridor, or they could tear themselves apart from the inside. Among the rising stars in their organization was a young enforcer named Dario Sepulveda. He was a quiet observer, a man who survived by watching the giants clash and knowing which way the wind was blowing. Dario saw the fracture before anyone else. He saw the coldness in Griselda's eyes every time Alberto spoke about their future. He knew that in a world of wolves, the one who feeds you is the only one who knows exactly where you are vulnerable. Griselda was the one feeding the machine, and Alberto was trying to bite the hand that held the ladle. The final escalation began 72 hours before that night in the Bogotá parking lot. It started in Queens. 3 of Alberto's most loyal distributors suddenly stopped reporting to him. They didn't disappear, and they weren't arrested. Instead, they began sending gifts to Griselda, expensive jewelry, rare watches, and cryptic messages of loyalty. Alberto was furious, but he couldn't understand how she had flipped them so quickly. He didn't realize that Griselda had already shown them the books. She had shown them that Alberto was stealing from the collective pot, putting their own livelihoods at risk to line his private Swiss nest egg. 2 days later, a mysterious fire broke out at a secure warehouse in the outskirts of Medellin. This wasn't a product warehouse. It was where Alberto kept his private records, the physical evidence of his side deals and his secret communications with the cartel elders. As the flames consumed the building, Alberto felt the walls closing in. He was losing his grip on the narrative. He was no longer the diplomat in control. He was a man being hunted by a ghost. On the 5th day, Griselda reached out. She played the part of the tired, defeated wife perfectly. She invited Alberto to a peace meeting in Bogotá, claiming she was exhausted by the friction and wanted to discuss her retirement. She suggested they meet late at night, away from the prying eyes of the cartel and the DEA, to settle their accounts and part ways as friends, if not as lovers. Alberto, blinded by his own ego and the belief that he had finally broken her spirit, agreed. He arrived at the parking lot with his personal security detail, a group of 6 men he believed were his shield against any threat. But as he stood there in the flickering light, watching Griselda stand her ground, the reality of his situation began to dawn on him. She wasn't there to negotiate a retirement. She was there to deliver a verdict. When she whispered that word, accountant, she wasn't just talking about the money. She was telling him that she knew about the Swiss account, the private meetings, and the lies he had told the Medellin elders. She was telling him that she had seen every move he made before he even made it. 4 minutes into that meeting, the atmosphere shifted from a domestic dispute to a corporate execution. The 6 men standing behind Alberto, men he had paid for years, didn't draw their weapons to protect him. They stood still, their eyes fixed on Griselda. They had realized something that Alberto had forgotten. Their paychecks were now signed by only one person, and it wasn't the man standing in front of them. The silence in the parking lot was absolute, broken only by the distant sound of the city and the hum of the streetlight. It was the silence of a hierarchy being permanently reset. In Griselda's hand was a gold-plated Mac 10, a gift Alberto had once given her to symbolize their joint power. Now it was the physical manifestation of her ultimate independence. The stage was set for the final confrontation, a moment that would change the course of the drug trade forever and prove that in the underworld The only thing more dangerous than an enemy is a partner who thinks they are smarter than the architect. The silence that followed the word accountant was heavier than the humid Bogotá air. In that flickering light of the parking lot, Alberto Bravo looked around at the 6 men he had brought for protection. These were men he had shared meals with, men whose families he had supported, men who were supposed to be his shield. But as the rain finally began to fall, a cold needle-like drizzle that blurred the edges of the world, Alberto saw the truth in their eyes. They weren't looking at him for orders. They were looking at Griselda, waiting for a signal. It was the ultimate betrayal of a betrayer. He had tried to build a kingdom on the shifting sands of ego, while Griselda had built hers on the bedrock of cold, hard mathematics. To these men, Alberto was a boss who spent money, but Griselda was the one who made it. And in their world, you never kill the person who knows how to make the machine run. Alberto tried to laugh, a dry, rattling sound that lacked any of his usual bravado. He took a step toward her, his hands open in a gesture of false transparency. He told her she was being paranoid, that the $5 million in Switzerland wasn't a theft, but a contingency fund for their children. He spoke of their early days in Queens, the cramped apartments, the shared dreams of a life beyond the struggle. He was trying to invoke the ghost of a marriage that he had already buried under a mountain of greed. But Griselda didn't flinch. She watched him with the detached curiosity of a scientist observing a dying specimen. She knew that every word coming out of his mouth was a liability. In the underworld, an explanation is just a long-winded way of admitting guilt. The tension reached its breaking point when Griselda reached into her waistband. She didn't move quickly. She didn't have to. There was no one there to stop her. She pulled out the gold-plated MAC-10, the very weapon Alberto had given her as a symbol of their joint power. In the dim light, the gold seemed to absorb the shadows, glowing with a dull, predatory luster. It was no longer a gift. It was a tool of corporate restructuring. Alberto's breath hitched. He realized then that the peace meeting wasn't a negotiation. It was a final audit. She wasn't there to hear his excuses. She was there to balance the books. The ledger was open, the numbers were red, and there was only one way to clear the debt. The confrontation didn't last long, but for those who witnessed it, it felt like an eternity. Alberto, realizing that his words had failed him, finally reached for his own weapon. It was a desperate, instinctive move, the last gasp of a man who realized his empire was a house of cards. But Griselda was faster. The MAC-10 roared, its mechanical rhythm echoing through the deserted parking lot like a frantic heartbeat. The smell of cordite and burnt oil replaced the scent of rain. It wasn't a clean execution. It was a chaotic, violent explosion of a broken partnership. Alberto managed to fire back, a stray bullet grazing Griselda's side, but the outcome was already written in the ledgers. As Alberto fell to the pavement, the gold-plated weapon in Griselda's hand remained steady. She didn't look away. She watched the life drain out of the man she had once called her partner, her husband, and the father of her children. To her, this wasn't a tragedy. It was a necessary deduction. When the echoes of the gunfire finally faded, the parking lot returned to its heavy, suffocating silence. The bodyguards didn't move to assist their fallen leader. They didn't even draw their weapons. They simply stood there, witnesses to the birth of a new era. Griselda, despite the wound in her side, didn't show pain. She wiped a stray droplet of rain from the barrel of the MAC-10 and looked at the men. There were no screams, no panic. She didn't need to give a speech. The hierarchy had been reset in the time it took to empty a magazine. She walked toward her car, her stride purposeful and unwavering, leaving the man who tried to steal her empire lying in the oil-stained puddles of a Bogotá night. The message was clear to everyone watching. Griselda Blanco didn't share the crown, and she never forgot a decimal point. In the next 72 hours, the dominoes began to fall with a precision that was terrifying to behold. Every Bravo loyalist within the organization was faced with a simple, brutal choice: swear total allegiance to the Madrinha or follow Alberto into the shadows. Those who hesitated were purged. Those who tried to flee found that their bank accounts had already been frozen, and their safe houses were no longer safe. Griselda didn't just kill her husband, she erased his entire infrastructure. She moved with a cold efficiency that left the Medellin cartel elders stunned. They had expected a messy civil war that would disrupt the flow of product. Instead, they got a streamlined, more disciplined operation that was more profitable than ever. They realized that while Alberto was a good face for the business, Griselda was the brains. Within 6 months, the name Bravo had been scrubbed from every DEA file and every cartel ledger. It was replaced by a single title that whispered through the streets of Miami and the boardrooms of Medellin: the Madrina, the Black Widow. She had proven that in a world dominated by men who valued ego over everything, a woman who valued control was the most dangerous force on the planet. She took the New York territory that Alberto had tried to steal and expanded it into a multi-state empire, turning the cocaine cowboys era into her personal playground. She didn't just survive the betrayal, she used it as the fuel to build a legacy that would haunt the American justice system for decades. But the cost of total power is always paid in the currency of humanity. The night in Bogotá wasn't just the end of Alberto Bravo. It was the end of Griselda Blanco's capacity for trust. From that point on, every person in her life was viewed through the lens of a balance sheet. Every ally was a potential liability. Every lover was a future debt to be settled. She became the ultimate paradox, the most powerful woman in the underworld, surrounded by thousands of loyal soldiers, yet utterly and completely alone. She had chosen her empire over the man who helped her build it, and in doing so, she had written the ultimate rule of her own survival. In a world of wolves, the only one you can truly trust is the one who sees the world in black and white, in profits and losses, in life and death. Years later, when historians and investigators looked back at the rise of the Medellin cartel, they would point to that October night as the moment the game changed. It wasn't just a domestic dispute, it was the professionalization of the drug trade. It was the moment the business moved from the hands of the flashy and the reckless into the hands of the strategic and the silent. Griselda Blanco had proven that silence is the deadliest weapon, and that a well-kept ledger is more powerful than 1,000 guns. She had dismantled a betrayal from the inside out and emerged not just as a survivor, but as a queen. This brings us to the final law of this dark universe. In a world of wolves, the one who feeds you is the only one who knows exactly where you are vulnerable. Alberto Bravo forgot that law. He thought he could bite the hand that fed the machine, not realizing that the hand was also holding the weapon. He underestimated the woman who had taught him everything he knew about the trade, and he paid for that error with his life and his legacy. Griselda didn't just kill him. She made sure he was a footnote in her story, a cautionary tale for anyone else who thought they could outmaneuver the Madrina. So, we are left with a final moral question. Was Griselda's reaction a necessary act of self-defense for her empire? Or was it the moment she traded the last of her humanity for total power? In the high-stakes world of the 1970s drug trade, could she have survived any other way? Or did she simply prove that to rule a kingdom built on blood, you have to be willing to shed the blood of the people you love the most? Some see her as a monster of her own making, while others see her as a strategist who did what was required to stay alive in a world that wanted her dead. If you found this deep dive into the shadows of history compelling, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe for more accounts of the power plays that shaped our world. We explore the stories that the archives try to hide, the moments where strategy meets survival. Now I want to hear from you in the comments below. If you were in Griselda's position, facing a partner who was actively stealing your life's work, would you have negotiated or would you have done exactly what she did? Is there room for mercy in a business built on betrayal? Let's discuss it. And if you're ready for another story of power and consequence, there is another one waiting for you right here on the channel. Thank you for watching.